Very good afternoon to all of you. I'm Dr. Kishore Wangal again with yet another of my State of the Union addresses, and this time it has all to do with the topic of seminal signification, the defense economics of India per se. In fact, this enunciation is all about the contents of a recently brought out anthology of mine in the realms of defense economics. In actuality, it all started way back in 1990 when I was in graduate school in the United States, and in July, August of 1990, we had the Gulf War with the Iraq invasion of Kuwait, and had just finished a course in advanced macroeconomic analysis, and I was bewildered no end to see multiple markets crash, resulting in a lot of losses to speculators, investors, both at the retail and institutional level. And apart from that, there were huge fluctuations in various markets, from commodities to the securities markets, which again had a bearing on short-term interest rates and so on and so forth. In fact, in a well-documented report thereafter, the Arab Monetary Fund pegged the number of actual expenditure at $620 billion US. Still later, in 92, the New York Times contained a well-documented article in September 1992, wherein they had cited the Arab Monetary Fund's finding as well. Just to put things in perspective, in 1993, the first quarter of 1993, the World Bank invested a sizable, but nowhere near this $620 billion, a tad over $100 billion, around $100 billion, in sub-Saharan Africa. And as early as 1997, they started seeing the results, the good results of their investments. And they had invested heavily in eventuating on certain infrastructure initiatives, and at the same time, good governance evolved. So $620 billion could have taken care of the entire educational requirements of and infrastructural requirements of sub-Saharan Africa or a large part of Latin America, and one could have seen all-round and meaningful development. So wars cost a lot of money, and I think all of us in the world should work towards enabling peace. Anyway, my interest was completely and comprehensively kindled, so much so that I decided to study meticulously the defense economics of two great nations, of two of the world's largest democracies, the United States of America and India. This enunciation is all about the defense economics of India, and I will be covering a 70-year period, 1947 till 2017. So there we go. In 1947, when India attained her independence, economically we were in dire straits. The British had looted us for a great period in time, and we did not invest in any of our capabilities like manufacturing and so on and so forth. It was a perennial loot which India had to bear, and to cap it all, at the time of independence we had to pay what was at that time a whopping amount to Pakistan as well. The net result being that the first Prime Minister of India, Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru, inherited a complete and comprehensive economic mess. This is the truth of the matter. And also, if you consider the fact that in the 30s and building up to 47, there were a number of issues, including the agrarian crisis in Bengal, and vast parts of India had drought, and there was also a lot of civil unrest and so on and so forth, that Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru actually inherited a huge mess, economic mess. Now, I'm stressing on this because I have read reports of certain economists and politicians who have actually criticized Pandit Nehru for having started off with the model of Fabian socialism. And when I researched the various alternatives that Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru had at the time, I am of the opinion, of the considered opinion, that he implemented what would would have been the best policy for India at that point in time. Because Fabian socialism inherently comes with four major coordinates. One, it has huge centralized planning. Two, a large number of PSUs, governmental loan entities, high levels of taxation, and high levels of regulation. Now, in keeping with the aforementioned, he incubated the Planning Commission of India. In fact, he himself became the chairman of the first Planning Commission, and under the vice chairmanship of Sir V.T. Krishnamachari, who had been the Prime Minister of Baroda and the Prime Minister of the Princely State of Jaipur, and a member of the Constituent Assembly as the vice chairman. And if you were to meticulously read the first three plans, which is each plan was for 5 years, it went into issues of agrarian reform, it went into irrigation, it went into basic infrastructure, it went into post and telegraph, and there was a huge emphasis on eventuating on welfareism per se. Food, clothing, and bathing shelter, and then basic shelter were the core issues that Pandit Nehru wanted to lay emphasis on, and the plans were reflective of that. Another issue which one would have to recognize during the period was that right from the first Finance Minister of India, R.K. Shanmugha Shetty, most of the finance ministers during the first 3 or 5 year plans, the three first, so that's for 15 years, almost went with the budget. I mean, the finance bill every year was dovetailed to meet the objectives as enunciated in the budget. There's a lot of synchronicity. Then, incubation of large public sector undertakings. And here I would like to mention a point that inherent to India's economic scheme of things is a Keynesian way of thinking. Not very surprising, because some of the great economists of that period, V.K. Ramaswamy, Sukhumai Chakravarti, Professor K.N. Raj, they were all, and even John Kenneth Galbraith endorsed it. I mean, they were all supportive of a Keynesian view, because they felt that interventionism by the government would provide for employment, and that's when the PSU started to happen. This was also the Russian model, and in fact, even Marx, for attaining full employment levels, suggested that interventionism is not a bad idea. So the fundamental issue here is that the thought ideation of J.M. Keynes held its work, and this, of course, period was characterized by high levels of taxation, because India needed the revenues to effectuate on welfareism per se, and it goes without saying that all industries were highly regulated. The British didn't leave us with many, and those that were formed were regulated, and rightly so, because they needed to be controls, checks and balances, and even at that time, India's population was over $200 million. Now, this model of Fabian socialism went on from circa 1947 till 1991 almost. In fact, in the period after Jawaharlal Nehru, after 64 and in 66 when Mrs. Gandhi came to power, the genre was almost similar, and And then she had to deal with a lot of socio-engineering issues, and then the 71 war with Pakistan, and thereafter the highly contumacious era, and more or less she struck to the same pattern of thinking, and then came on Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi, who actually realized that India does require to industrialize, and employment levels should be at highly acceptable levels as well. So that was something which Mr. Gandhi did, and this entire period, till 91 was characterized by the format of Fabian socialism, and welfarism was given precedence. Now, let me go back to 47 and talk of the signification of the ideation of a professor called Professor Blackett. Immediately after independence, India had a Pashtun invasion. This Pashtun invasion was backed by the violent venal state of Pakistan, and immediately there, India, of course, was able to handle that issue, and after that, the Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru commissioned Professor Blackett, a Nobel Prize winner in physics, who was asked to suggest the kind of weapon systems India should go for. Professor Blackett, after a meticulous study, came up with an opposite recommendation as far as the defense systems went, and and it was primarily based on his report that JN, and in keeping with the intervention model, went in for many ordnance factories. Today I think it's past 42, and then also to several PSUs. In fact, that was the time when HAL and a few other big defense PSUs came into being. And Professor Blackett also made one recommendation. He overshot his brief and made a recommendation saying that under no circumstance should India exceed 2% of her GDP in terms of defense expenditure. Of course, he didn't elaborate more on that, and therefore later on there were some issues to do with that. Nonetheless, if you see the entire, all the wars India has fought, the 47 Pashtun invasion, the 65 and 71 war with Pakistan, the 62 war with China, the Goa Liberation War, and then the issue with Kargil and Siachen Glacier in the 80s and Kargil in the late 90s. During all these periods, when we had skirmishes or wars, in the immediate aftermath of that, in most cases, and most pronounced, it was in the 62 war, the defense spending spiked up to well beyond 3%. Now, the reason why I'm saying 3% is there was a very well-studied report which came out in 1959, and this was done by many of the intelligentsia in the Indian Army, and the report said that India has to spend at least 3% of her GDP on defense expenditure. So, except for the periods after wars, more or less the 70-year period, India has spent less than 2%, and this was more pronounced in the 47 to 91 period, because India then did not witness high levels of GDP growth. We probably had around 3% or so, and that was the way in which things shaped up in terms of defense economics as well. Come 1991, after the curious gallimaufry of people and parties were in power for about a year and a half too, after 89, in 91, the brilliance of Narasimha Rao brought in liberalization. And I would like to make a point here that as the industries minister in his own cabinet, it was P.V. Narasimha Rao who actually initiated the first liberalization moves in the country, the Department of Industrial Promotion. And then, as a reaction, the Finance Ministry and other ministries took over. So the brilliance of Narasimha Rao saw India's economy grow well past 6, and then finally almost 8.5%. And even though we spent still less than 2%, the amount we spent was much higher. So this was enabling. And subsequent to that, the genius of an A.B. Vajpayee ensured that India has great weapon systems, and that India does spend enough money on that. And in fact, it was the legendary Atal Bihari Vajpayee who incubated the Defence Modernization Fund for capital acquisition initiatives. And largely due to the great work done by A.B. Vajpayee, the period from 2004 to 2009 went off very well for UPA 1. Nonetheless, they didn't get past the 2% expenditure rule. And of course, UPA 2 was a disaster, but nonetheless, even then, we still had less than 2% spent on defense expenditure. And in Modi 1.0, we, for some reason, kept to the sub 2% rule. And hopefully in Modi 2.0 it changes, and the most important change which will have to be seen is the Defence Capitalization Fund should be made a fully functional fund, and there should be a way in which money is invested every year. I'll come to that in the later part of the narration. And pretty much we were under the 2% rule. The anthology actually contains all the statistics. It contains everything from 1947 to 2017, the plan outlays, the amount we spent on defense expenditure, how much we spent on welfareism, how we juxtapose welfareism with defense expenditure, so on and so forth. This entire, all the statistics are available at, in the anthology of 36 articles. To cut a long story short, India has 4 albatrosses or significant issues which need to be addressed with her defense economics. The first one is primarily centric to theoretical economics, in that the issue with the GDP. The gross domestic product, ironically, was effectuated at a time when it was during the wars, when the US administration wanted to know a yardstick vis-a-vis the economy. And whilst doing so, they asked Professor Simon Kuznets to come up with this yardstick. After a detailed study, the renowned economist came up with a GDP, which largely takes into consideration the manufacturing base. But in the Internet of Everything age, where the service sectors are very high, almost 80% in some countries is service sector, the GDP is not reflective of everything, especially the real GDP, and there are a few contumacious issues which will have to be dealt with. Suffice to state, whilst nominal GDP is passable because it is emblematic of consumerism and the amount we spend as consumers, real GDP really needs to be worked on. And in fact, France has moved on to a global wellness index, which takes into account some of the major macroeconomic markets, studies them individually and then collectively, and comes up with a yardstick wherein you can juxtapose economic growth. So this is something which needs to be done by India and other countries as well. In fact, many countries are working towards it in a very highly perceptive manner. Another point to do with the GDP is about statistics. Ironically, in most countries, and recently we witnessed that in India as well, by simply moving the base here, an incumbent government can make it look like their performance has been excellent. Because remember, it's all juxtaposed to a base year, and by moving the base year around, many things can be done by number jugglery. So that is another issue of which has to be tackled. And on the same subject, and also on the theoretical aspects of defense economics, I'd like to mention something else here. In that, fundamentally, if you even go into one of the ancient economic treatises like that of the Arthashastra of Chanakya, to the humongous contributions of Lionel Robbins, all the theoretical ideations were based on logic, on the subject of logic, inferential deduction, syllogism, so on and so forth, wherein using logic, the economic arguments were made. In fact, Lionel Robbins in the first half of the last century clearly made this point and argued against the overuse of math and stat. But somewhere in the 60s, actually, in the US, a whole bunch of wannabe and failed mathematicians turned economists, and the net result is that we have a surfeit of math, and many a time we have to wonder what the economics is, which is sad. We're actually in the field of economics and not math. As you know, somebody, a renowned economist, recently put it, math and stat are good to corroborate and to reiterate, but they are not economics per se. And defense economics, therefore, has been largely affected because when they study the markets, multiple markets, using certain macroeconomic equations, the endogenous and exogenous variables and the parameters for that, it may not in reality reflect the need of the hour. So this is another area where there should be much focus, and I believe that economics has to return to ways of logic. In fact, the anthology uses logic to rivet all the points it does. However, for the sake of following the contemporary dictates, all the statistics has been provided for, and it is also in some chapters, in some articles, provided for the mathematical reasoning behind a particular point or two. So this is the first albatross, which is GDP. The second albatross, and very pertinent for India, though a political issue and largely part of the political economic realm, is that of the UNSC, or the United Nations Security Council. The United Nations Security Council is an effete organization, and I will straight away get to the point as to why I call it effete vis-a-vis India, because the UN Security Council is run like a junta and not in an equitable manner. To get to the point, had 9/11 happened in India and not in New York, in the United States, I don't think we would have had the same kind of reaction. Now the issue here is simple. The United States, a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council, has literally bankrolled Pakistan's defense expenditure program. And India had to face the consequence of that for decades. We had to spend much more than what we would have. We could have spent that money on welfareism, but we had to spend it on defense because we had to deal with the Pakistanis. So the United Nations Security Council should become an egalitarian one. Actually, I would like to point out something here. The League of Nations, which is the precursor to the United Nations itself, was based on a multipolar model. And here again I have to mention that the greatest contribution of Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru was that he incubated the non-aligned movement, which by its very definition made the world out to be a multipolar world. Now this would mean regional economies will do well, regional cooperation and equitableness would be a real thing from a global perspective. So the United Nations Security Council needs to do a lot more work towards promoting peace, and for starters, the UN Security Council must become an egalitarian one, and India definitely requires to be in the UN Security Council. Now let's move on to the third albatross, which is the 3% rule. In 1959, when this rule was first effectuated, it's hardly been followed, exceptions being in the immediate years after the wars we've had. But when Professor Blackett came up with the 2% rule, what he left unanswered was how much of that would go to the capital account and how much will go to revenue account. Unfortunately, what happened was that the Ministry of Defense ensured in India that both the revenue and the capital model comes within the 2%. As an indicative archetype, I think last financial year we spent over 1,29,000 crores in salaries and pensions out of a total outlay of around I guess around 4 lakh crores or something, which means it's all there in the anthology, which means that we spend a sizable percentage, the demand for grants, which is the what is the nomenclature in the budgetary process of India, for our human capital requirements. Whilst I will readily agree that Indian soldiers are the best in the world, given a British general and the American weapon systems will be invincible, but the point here is that we do spend a lot of money in that, and therefore we have to go to a higher amount of expenditure for capital account. I have just argued against the GDP. So the best way to do this is to identify via a Defense Technology Council as to the kind of weapon systems we do require. And after we do that over the medium to long term, and then strategize with the Defense Acquisition Council as to how they are going to go about effectuating the acquisition, and allowing the Defense Acquisition Council to caucus with the Ministry of Finance to realize and understand how they will raise the necessary money required for that. Now let me give you a simple solution here, which is very simple but certainly highly workable. I just said that a whole bunch of failed mathematicians have gone in, and therefore logical ways have been bypassed. This has resulted in multiple views on the same subject. Let's take the subject of taxation. We've had economists in this country saying we have to do away with taxation. The others, of course, have said different things. But my analysis and a study of 1,000 taxpayers has very clearly established a point that if we bring down the levels of income tax to 15 to 18% and corporate tax to around 21%, we would be ensuring much greater compliance. And the way forward is for defense acquisition initiatives is to enhance the tax base, widen the tax base, and anybody who's above the poverty line should be made to pay a slab rate of around, say, 1,000 rupees a year. And at 1,000 rupees a year, my calculations simply stated that we'll have about 4.2 times more revenue per year because we widen the tax base, and then we will find the necessary money to invest in defense acquisition initiatives. So when we do get to a wellness index or to a better barometer of the economy, this is a key factor which we should note in. And this, what we should note is that we have to first and foremost understand what we have to spend in terms of the technology, and then find the ways and means to get that. Now, this is a unique time to do it, and the reason being that the next genre of war is going to be the military uses of outer space. India is uniquely poised to take advantage of the situation, as ISRO is one of the best space organizations in the world. So we are already one up in the game. Provided we are able to raise the additional resources, we will be really having a strong defense going forward. And the fourth albatross, which is very, very sad, given that we had phenomenal personalities as the founding fathers of this nation, Mahatma Gandhi, Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru, Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, a whole bunch of them who actually were great stalwarts in every way. But unfortunately, we have allowed corruption and cronyism to creep into the defense acquisition scheme of things. Corruption and cronyism hurt our defense preparedness because we get less after spending more money, and also there is a delay, and this is causative of certain issues to do with defense preparedness per se. And again, the Defense Acquisition Council can have an ethical wing wherein 10 or 20 men and women, citizens of this country, who are well known and above board, can be bought in, and in a democratic way, on a no-names basis, they can decide on what has to be paid for a particular equipment. this has been done in several countries, including the United States, and given that India, as I always say, is the most intelligent country in the world, Indians are the most intelligent in the world, and therefore we can do a number of things to ensure that these deals are done in an above-board fashion. So once we handle these 4 albatrosses, India will have the necessary money to invest without compromising on welfareism and infrastructure building, and therefore we'll have a great defense. And a great defense is peace enabling. It allows for substantive development, and India will once again get back to being top amongst the comity of nations. Thank you so very much. It was wonderful addressing you all. Jai Hind.